The smell woke me before the light did. It wasn't the cozy scent of a wood-burning fireplace or the rich aroma of morning coffee. It was the sharp, toxic chemical stench of synthetic lace and premium silk melting into the hand-laid cobblestones of a private estate. It was the smell of a $5,000 custom-designed bridal gown being reduced to black sludge. I didn't gasp. I didn't panic. My heart rate didn't even spike. In my line of work as a healthcare fraud analyst in Boston, panic is a liability. When you spend 40 hours a week tracking down multi-million-dollar phantom medical billings, forged physician signatures, and shell pharmaceutical companies that people go to federal prison to protect you, learn one fundamental truth. Emotions distort data. Numbers don't lie, but people do, especially the people who think they are untouchable. I slid out from the Egyptian cotton sheets of the guest suite, my bare feet hitting the cool, polished hardwood. I didn't put on slippers. I didn't grab a robe. I simply walked toward the heavy French doors, unlocked them with a quiet metallic click, and stepped out into the humid, midnight air of Cape Cod. The fog was rolling in off the Atlantic, thick and heavy, but it couldn't choke out the orange glow illuminating the stone courtyard. There she stood. Eleanor, my future mother-in-law. She was positioned over the blazing pile of white fabric, like a high society witch presiding over a sacrifice. She wore her signature champagne-colored silk robe, her silver blonde hair perfectly coiffed, not a single strand out of place despite the hour. In her right hand, she held a heavy vintage gold lighter, the flame dancing against the pristine diamonds on her fingers. When the soles of my feet slapped against the damp stone, she didn't flinch. She had been waiting for me. Eleanor turned around slowly, the firelight catching the sharp, angular contours of her face. She was a woman who practically owned Beacon Hill, a matriarch from a dynasty of old-money New England physicians, and right now she wore a manic, desperate smile. It was the chilling look of a predator who believed she had just won a war she was terrified of losing. She took a slow, deliberate step back from the rising smoke, looked me dead in the eye, and clicked the lighter shut. The metallic snap echoed in the quiet courtyard. "Now," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with that smooth, practiced New England aristocratic charm that sounded like a benediction but operated like a scalpel. "Try walking down that aisle." She paused, her chest rising and falling heavily as she waited for the fallout. She expected a textbook breakdown. She wanted me to scream, to drop to my knees on the cobblestones, to clutch at the burning remains of my wedding dress, and to beg her to tell me how she could be so unspeakably cruel. Eleanor fed on emotional wreckage. She had built her entire social standing on making people feel small, inadequate, and entirely powerless. She wanted a performance, but I didn't give her a single tear. I didn't even raise my eyebrows. I just stood there in the quiet courtyard, my arms crossed, and looked at her. I watched the orange embers reflect in her eyes, and instead of focusing on the burning dress, I focused on the data. I analyzed her body language the same way I analyze a fraudulent corporate balance sheet. And that's when I saw the anomaly. Eleanor was trying very hard to project absolute dominance, but her left hand was trembling. The heavy gold lighter was rattling faintly against the platinum bands of her rings. Her breathing was too shallow, too fast. She thought she was burning a wedding dress. More importantly, she thought she was destroying a high-capacity encrypted USB drive that I had intentionally let her believe was sewn into the inner lining of that gown. She thought she was burning the only physical copy of the offshore bank ledger's wire transfers and shell company documents that would strip her of her status, her freedom, and send her straight to a federal penitentiary for grand embezzlement. She thought she had just saved herself. I looked down at the pile of melting lace, then looked back up at her pristine, smug face. I offered her a tiny, completely neutral nod. The cut of that dress never really suited my frame anyway. I said, my voice deadpan, completely devoid of inflection. But the fire is an interesting touch, Eleanor. Very theatrical. Her manic smile faltered. The corners of her mouth twitched. The utter lack of a reaction from me was a virus entering her operating system. She had expected a broken girl from Queens. Instead, she was looking at a stone wall. Without waiting for her reply, I turned my back on her while the fabric was still smoking. I walked inside the estate, my bare feet moving silently across the marble tiles of the grand hallway, and went straight to the gourmet kitchen. I didn't shake. My hands were perfectly steady as I opened the sub-zero refrigerator, grabbed a pitcher, and poured myself a glass of ice water. My phone sat on the white quartz island, its screen dark. I picked it up and dialed Caleb. He answered on the very first ring. There was no grogginess in his voice. He wasn't asleep. He had been sitting in his car 3 miles down the road waiting for my signal. His voice was wide awake, steady, and hard as granite. "Is it done?" Caleb asked. I took a slow sip of the cold water, looked out the massive kitchen window at his mother, who was still standing proudly over the pile of ashes in the courtyard, completely oblivious to the security cameras Caleb had hidden in the ivy-covered brick walls earlier that week. "She took the bait," I said softly into the receiver. "We have her. Every single frame." "I'm turning the car around." Turning, Caleb replied, the line going dead. I set the phone back down on the counter. The trap was officially sprung, but to understand how a high society matriarch ended up burning a wedding dress at 2 o'clock in the morning, you have to look at the paper trail. You have to go back 6 months. Let me take you back to a quiet Tuesday afternoon. A stack of heavy cream vendor contracts, and the exact moment I realized my wedding wasn't a celebration, it was being used to cover up a $1 million federal crime. 6 months before the smoke cleared over the Cape Cod courtyard, the war began with a single piece of heavy cream cardstock. We were sitting in the formal dining room of Eleanor's brownstone in Beacon Hill, Boston. The room smelled of expensive lemon polish old money and imported white lilies that were replaced every 3 days by a boutique florist. Caleb sat right next to me, his broad shoulders tensed. His attention split between his mother's sharp voice and a digital blueprint open on his tablet. Caleb is an orthopedic surgeon, a man who views the world through the lens of structural integrity, precision, and clean lines. He had grown up inside the suffocating privilege of this estate, surrounded by generational wealth his late father had accumulated, but he had never allowed it to dictate his character. He built his own private practice from scratch, taking out independent bank loans and working 80-hour weeks to ensure his success was earned, not handed down. Eleanor, however, treated her late husband's medical legacy like a sovereign kingdom, and she viewed me as a highly undesirable immigrant trying to cross her borders. I grew up in a drafty 2-family house in Queens, New York. My parents were blue-collar workers who clocked 40 hours a week, balanced the family checkbook on a scratched laminate kitchen table, and bought their sedans used. To Eleanor, my background wasn't just a difference in tax brackets, it was a genetic liability. She genuinely believed that my ordinary upbringing would somehow dilute the prestigious bloodline of her family. With a practiced theatrical elegance, Eleanor slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the polished mahogany table. Her manicured, French-tipped fingers tapped the cover once a sharp clack that sounded like a judge's gavel. "I have taken the liberty of finalizing the preliminary contracts for the reception," she said. Her voice possessed that smooth, mid-Atlantic aristocratic cadence that was designed to sound like a compliment, but operated like a razor-sharp scalpel. "I know you and Caleb wanted to handle the arrangements yourselves, Audrey dear, but a wedding of this caliber requires a certain pedigree. We must maintain the Boston elite aesthetic. Our guests have incredibly high expectations, and I would absolutely hate for your family to feel overwhelmed by the financial nuances of a proper high society event." Caleb looked up from his tablet, his jaw tightening instantly. "Mum, we already settled this. Audrey and I are paying for our own wedding. We established a strict budget and we are sticking to it. Eleanor offered a tight, patronizing smile that didn't even come close to reaching her cold grey eyes. A budget is a wonderful, quaint concept for a starter home, Caleb. But this is the social event of the season. Your late father would turn in his grave if we served ordinary catering or utilized a discount venue. I am merely supplementing the costs from the family estate trust. Consider it my wedding gift to you both. Please just let me handle the invoices, dear. It will save Audrey so much unnecessary stress. She pushed the folder 2 inches closer to me. The gesture wasn't an act of generosity. It was an open challenge. She expected me to feel inadequate, intimidated, and deeply grateful. She expected me to defer blindly to her wealth, assuming a girl from Queens wouldn't know any better. I didn't flinch. I opened the folder, but I didn't look at the silk linen swatches, the calligraphy samples, or the elaborate floral arrangements. I flipped straight past the marketing fluff and went directly to the itemized vendor invoices at the back. My job as a healthcare fraud analyst requires me to audit millions of dollars in medical insurance data. I spend my life hunting down phantom surgeries, double-billed laboratory fees, and ghost suppliers invented by corrupt clinics to launder money. I know exactly what a legitimate financial document looks like. I also know the exact, subtle red flags that appear when someone is trying very hard to manipulate the data. My eyes landed on the contract for our venue, the Grand Plaza, a historic exclusive landmark in the heart of downtown Boston. According to the printed document Eleanor had proudly provided, the required upfront security deposit to secure the grand ballroom was $65,000. I stared at the bolded number. My brain catalogued and cross-referenced the data instantly. I had toured the Grand Plaza exactly 3 weeks ago with my maid of honor. I remembered their private corporate pricing brochure vividly. I didn't frown. I didn't look up and accuse her of inflating the numbers. Confrontation without absolute proof is a rookie mistake. It gives the target time to construct a defense and destroy the paper trail. Instead, I kept my face entirely neutral. I closed the leather folder, offered Eleanor a polite professional nod, and thanked her for her meticulous organization. I told her I would review the details later and file them away for our records. Eleanor looked deeply satisfied, leaning back in her chair with the smug aura of a woman who believed she had just purchased my submission. That evening, I sat at the small desk in the North End apartment Caleb and I shared. The space was dead quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Caleb was asleep in the bedroom, exhausted from a grueling 6-hour spinal reconstruction surgery. I opened my laptop, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and pulled up the hidden public rate sheet for the Grand Plaza through an archived commercial real estate database. I scrolled down to their peak season weekend wedding rates. The standard required security deposit for a full ballroom buyout was $30,000. I pulled the physical invoice Eleanor had given me out of my bag and placed it under my desk lamp, comparing the two side by side. Eleanor's invoice stated $65,000. Exactly $35,000 was completely unaccounted for. A normal bride might assume it was a simple clerical error. A normal bride might think the venue had hidden service fees or raised their rates for high-profile families. But I am not a normal bride. I am an auditor. Numbers don't have emotions, they don't exaggerate, and they don't magically double on their own. When a financial figure jumps by more than 100%, it means someone is actively moving capital in the dark. I scrutinized the layout of Eleanor's invoice. The font was standard Arial, but the corporate logo at the top was slightly pixelated, an obvious indication that it had been low-resolution copied and pasted from a public website rather than generated by the venue's professional billing software. There was no itemized breakdown of the tax margins or insurance fees, just a flat inflated figure. It was a sloppy, arrogant forgery created by a woman who assumed the people around her were too polite or too intimidated to ever question her paperwork. But I didn't just want to know that she was lying. I needed to know exactly where the missing money was going. Attached to the back of the forged venue invoice was a printout of a bank wire transfer confirmation slip. Eleanor had deliberately included it to prove to Caleb that the $65,000 had already been deducted from his late father's estate trust, painting herself as the ultimate benevolent provider. The confirmation slip listed a routing number and an encrypted account number. In my line of work, tracing illicit funds is second nature. Corrupt medical providers frequently use complex routing paths and fake medical supply companies to hide illegal kickbacks, and I knew exactly how to follow the digital breadcrumbs. I fired up my secure corporate workstation, bypassed the standard consumer firewalls, and entered the routing number from Eleanor's wire transfer into a federal financial institution directory database. The screen flashed, loading the secure data. The routing number did not belong to the Grand Plaza. It didn't belong to any hospitality group, catering company, or wedding vendor in the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The funds had been wired directly to a commercial holding bank located in Wilmington, Delaware. The receiving account belonged to a private domestic limited liability company registered under the name Apex Primrose Holdings. I leaned back in my office chair, the cold blue glow of the monitor illuminating the dark walls of the room. The harsh reality settled heavily into my bones. Eleanor wasn't supplementing our wedding costs out of the goodness of her heart. She was using our upcoming wedding as a legal smokescreen to systematically siphon massive amounts of cash out of Caleb's rightful inheritance. She generated a fake, inflated invoice, presented it to us to justify the massive expenditure from the family trust, and then wired the money directly into an offshore shell company that she secretly controlled. She was actively stealing from her own son. I sat there in the quiet dark, a cold anger radiating through me. Eleanor thought I was just a naive, unrefined middle-class girl who would be totally dazzled by her Beacon Hill address and country club memberships. She had absolutely no clue that she had just handed forged financial documents to a woman who catches professional white-collar embezzlers for a living. My first instinct was to walk into the bedroom and wake Caleb up, but I stopped myself. He fiercely loved his mother. He believed her difficult narcissistic personality was just a tragic byproduct of the intense grief she experienced after losing his father. Showing him a single $35,000 discrepancy wouldn't be enough to shatter a lifetime of conditioning. Eleanor would easily spin it. She would cry, claim it was an administrative error made by her personal assistant, and paint me as a paranoid, ungrateful, gold-digging outsider who was actively trying to tear their family apart. If I was going to expose her, I couldn't just bring a knife to a gunfight. I needed the entire financial architecture of her fraud. I needed to know exactly how much she had stolen over the 7 years since Caleb's father died. I closed my laptop and formulated a long-term strategy to audit Eleanor properly. To get the absolute proof, I needed unrestricted access to her home office inside the Beacon Hill brownstone. I needed her unencrypted master hard drive. And to get that, I needed a massive psychological distraction. I needed her to be so entirely focused on destroying me emotionally that she left her financial perimeter completely unguarded. I wouldn't have to wait very long for her to strike again. Eleanor was already laying the groundwork for her next calculated attack. Sensing that I wasn't as easily intimidated or broken as she had initially hoped during the dinner, she decided that isolating me from the rest of the family was her best tactical strategy. She needed Caleb's extended family to view me as an imminent threat, so that if I ever spoke up about the finances, no one would believe a single word I said. 2 days later, the whispers officially started. My phone began buzzing on my desk at work, with strange passive-aggressive text messages from Caleb's distant cousins. A carefully orchestrated malicious narrative was spreading like wildfire through the Boston high society social circuit. Eleanor was setting the stage to paint me as unstable, deeply in debt, and vindictive. And to ensure the match was lit properly, she had just invited Caleb's wealthy, status-obsessed ex-girlfriend Chloe back into town to help execute the ambush. The whisper campaign did not start with a shout. It began on a damp Thursday morning with the soft, persistent vibration of my phone against the dark oak of my office desk. At the time, I was knee-deep in a complex medical data audit, cross-referencing hundreds of fraudulent physical therapy claims from an upscale clinic in Back Bay. I reached over and flipped the phone screen up. It was a text message from Caleb's Aunt Patricia, a woman who spent her winters in Palm Beach and her summers pretending to be a philanthropist. I had spoken to her exactly once briefly at a charity gala 3 months prior. The message read, "Audrey, dear, I know wedding planning can be an incredibly stressful endeavor for someone not accustomed to managing large budgets. But please do not take your personal financial frustrations out on Eleanor. She is only trying to guide you through the expectations of our social circle. Let's try to keep things dignified." I stared at the screen, my eyes narrowing as I processed the cold, clinical condescension woven into every word. Before I could even lock the screen, another notification popped up. This one was a text from a cousin of Caleb's named Julianne, a girl I had met exactly twice at family dinners. Her message was disguised as a careless mistake, a classic text sent to the wrong person maneuver. It read, "Honestly, Caleb needs to demand an ironclad multi-million-dollar prenup. She is so transparently using this wedding to get her hands on the family estate trust. Aunt Eleanor is practically beside herself with worry over how reckless she's being with the budget." I set my phone face down on the desk with a quiet, deliberate tap. The pieces on the board were moving exactly as I had predicted. Eleanor had realized that I didn't flinch when she handed me the inflated venue contract. She knew that an experienced analyst wouldn't just overlook a massive financial document, and her survival instincts were kicking in. Sensing that I was quietly examining her paperwork, she had decided to systematically incinerate my credibility before I could ever utter a word of truth to Caleb. She knew how the legal and social structures of the Boston elite worked. If a middle-class girl from Queens suddenly accused a prominent Beacon Hill matriarch of multi-thousand-dollar grand larceny and embezzlement, the family would demand context, and Caleb would demand absolute proof. But if Eleanor planted the seed early that I was drowning in personal debt, deeply unstable, prone to hysterical fits of paranoia, and lashing out over our wedding budget, any financial discrepancy I brought forward later would be dismissed as the desperate fabrications of a gold digger trying to cover her own tracks. According to a colleague who hovered on the periphery of Eleanor's country club, the matriarch had spent the previous afternoon playing the role of the deeply concerned, tragic mother over high tea. She told her inner circle that I was entirely cracking under the pressure of marrying into a legacy family, implying that my mental fragility was a threat to Caleb's demanding medical career. But whispers and passive-aggressive text messages were never enough for a woman like Eleanor. She didn't just want to weaken my position, she required a public execution. She needed an undeniable, visible incident where I lost my temper, created a scene, or broke down in public, so she could point her manicured finger and say, "Look at her. Look at the erratic, hostile woman my son is throwing his life away for." To orchestrate this public meltdown, Eleanor sent me an email the following morning inviting me to her Beacon Hill estate on Sunday afternoon for what she termed a mandatory floral and aesthetic consultation. When I walked through the grand leaded glass front doors of the brownstone that Sunday, the air inside was thick with the suffocating scent of fresh blooming orchids and expensive French perfume. The housekeeper escorted me past the oil portraits of Caleb's ancestors and straight into the sunlit conservatory at the back of the house. Eleanor was seated at a white wrought-iron patio table, looking radiant in a custom-tailored pastel blazer. But she wasn't alone. Sitting directly across from her elegantly sipping iced matcha from a crystal tumbler was Chloe. Chloe was Caleb's wealthy ex-girlfriend from his undergraduate days at Harvard. She possessed the kind of effortless, rigid posture that comes from decades of competitive equestrian training and grew up summering in Martha's Vineyard. Her father ran one of the most aggressive hedge funds in Manhattan. She was exactly the type of woman Eleanor had spent 10 years grooming Caleb to marry. Chloe still lingered around the edges of the family's inner circle, armed with a multi-carat diamond tennis bracelet and a sharp, vacant smile that operated as a thinly veiled insult to anyone outside her tax bracket. "Audrey, darling," Eleanor said, rising gracefully from her chair and smoothing the front of her linen trousers. "I hope you don't mind." Chloe happened to drop by the neighborhood to visit her family, and since she possesses such absolutely exquisite taste in event design, I asked her to stay and help us finalize the centerpiece concepts. "You've seemed so entirely overwhelmed by the minor details lately, I thought you could truly use the upper-class guidance." Chloe offered me a brilliant, hollow smile, her eyes scanning my off-the-rack trench coat with immediate clinical dismissal. "It's so lovely to see you again, Audrey," she purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Eleanor was just telling me about the severe budget constraints you've been insisting on for the reception. I know how deeply stressful it must be when you simply cannot afford the high-end aesthetic you actually want for a proper Boston wedding. I told Eleanor I would be more than happy to personally pay for the upgraded white hydrangea arrangements as my official gift to you both." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her grey eyes locked entirely onto my face. She was waiting for the snap. She was practically begging me to feel humiliated, to raise my voice, or to storm out of the house in a fit of jealous, lower-class rage so she could immediately dial Caleb and report my unstable, aggressive behavior. But in corporate logistics and fraud analysis, when a hostile party deliberately introduces an aggressive disruption to your system, you do not fight the disruption. You absorb it, reassign it, and use its own momentum to destabilize them. I didn't lower my purse. I didn't frown. Instead, I pulled out the wrought-iron chair, sat down calmly, and placed my black leather portfolio flat on the glass table. I looked directly at Chloe and offered her a bright, highly professional smile. "Chloe, that is incredibly generous of you," I said, my voice steady and warm. "Having extra administrative and clerical support today will easily save me hours of tedious data tracking. Eleanor is absolutely right. There are so many minor, low-level details to catalogue." Chloe blinked. Her perfect vacant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Administrative support," she repeated, her voice tightening. "Yes." I continued smoothly, opening my portfolio and sliding a completely blank legal pad and a heavy silver pen directly across the glass toward her. "Since you're so eager to help with the logistics, I need someone to meticulously tabulate the stem counts for all 40 reception tables, cross-reference them with the seasonal availability charts, and calculate the exact vendor tax margins for the secondary floral arrangements. If you could have those spreadsheets drafted and calculated by 4 o'clock, it would be a tremendous help to the planning committee." Chloe stared at the blank legal pad, as if I had just handed her a live grenade. She was entirely accustomed to being treated as a wealthy, dangerous rival, a lingering romantic threat to be feared and envied. I didn't treat her like a threat. I treated her like an unpaid, low-level corporate intern. "But I don't know anything about calculating vendor tax margins," Chloe stammered, her rigid posture stiffening into pure outrage as she looked at the silver pen. I kept my voice exceptionally bright, encouraging, and condescendingly sweet. "Oh, don't worry, it's just basic, repetitive data entry. I can easily show you the formula on my phone. It's incredibly tedious work, but since you're so dedicated to helping our family out, I'm sure you won't mind." Eleanor's face flushed a deep, angry crimson as she realized her psychological trap had completely backfired. She opened her mouth to intervene, her voice sharp with defensive irritation. "Audrey, stop this nonsense. Chloe is a guest in my home. She is certainly not here to do manual paperwork or clerical data entry." I tilted my head slightly, feigning absolute innocent confusion. "But Eleanor, you just said less than a minute ago that she was here to provide guidance and ease my stress. The manual calculations are the only stressful part of this process. I've already selected the aesthetic layout. I assumed she was actually here to be useful. Chloe slammed her hand lightly against the table, tossing the silver pen aside, her wealthy pride deeply insulted. Eleanor, I thought we were looking at high-end design mood boards from New York. I am not a secretary. The entire dynamic in the conservatory shifted instantly. Chloe's frustration was no longer directed at me. She was thoroughly annoyed with Eleanor for luring her into a social situation where she was being forced to look foolish and domestic. Eleanor began scrambling to soothe her, desperately pulling out glossy luxury design magazines and barking orders to the housekeeper for more tea. Within minutes, the two upper-class women were bickering intensely over the exact shade of velvet napkins and table linens, their voices rising in the humid air of the conservatory. The distraction was flawless. The perimeter was unguarded. I stood up quietly, offering a polite excuse about needing to utilize the restroom. Neither woman even looked up from the magazine spreads. They were entirely consumed by their own petty social friction. I walked out of the conservatory, crossed the vast marble hallway, and slipped silently through the heavy double mahogany doors of Eleanor's private home office. I clicked the door shut behind me, the thick wood instantly muffling the sounds of the house. The office smelled of old dust, expensive leather, and Eleanor's signature perfume. Her massive, custom-built Apple desktop computer sat prominently on a polished mahogany executive desk. People who believe they are completely untouchable and superior to everyone else rarely practice good digital security. They assume no one would ever dare cross their threshold. I nudged the mouse. The massive screen illuminated instantly. It wasn't even locked. My hands were perfectly steady, my pulse calm. I pulled a high-capacity, ultra-fast, portable solid-state drive from the inner pocket of my coat and plugged it into the back of the monitor. I opened the file explorer with rapid, precise clicks. Eleanor kept her digital life incredibly organized in plain sight. Right there on the desktop was a master folder labeled in bold text, Estate Financials and Trust Management. Inside were neatly categorized subfolders containing monthly bank statements, federal tax returns, investment portfolio reports, and corporate wire history dating back nearly a decade. I didn't waste time looking at individual files. I clicked on the master folder, dragged it directly onto my portable solid-state drive, and watched a blue progress bar appear on the screen, copying 14.2 gigabytes. An estimated time remaining 90 seconds. Every single second felt like an eternity. I held my breath. My eyes locked onto the brass door handle of the office. Suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the marble hallway outside. I tensed my fingers, gripping the edge of the mahogany desk. The footsteps grew louder, pausing right outside the office door. I braced myself, calculating my excuse. But the shadow under the door passed. It was just the housekeeper, carrying a fresh tray of laundry toward the back staircase. The progress bar on the screen flashed green. Transfer complete. I safely ejected the drive, pulled it out of the USB port, and dropped it into my deep coat pocket. I closed the file explorer, leaving the desktop exactly as I had found it. When I walked back into the conservatory 2 minutes later, Chloe was already gathering her designer handbag, announcing she had a sudden severe headache and needed to return to her hotel. Eleanor looked utterly exhausted and socially defeated. Her grand psychological ambush reduced to a petty argument about table linens. I thanked Chloe warmly for her valuable time, collected my portfolio, and calmly told Eleanor that I needed to head home to review the vendor data. That night, I sat at my desk in the North End apartment, with the door locked from the inside. Caleb was away on a late-night emergency call at the hospital. The city outside was dead quiet. I plugged the cloned drive into my secure laptop and opened the estate files. I spent 4 hours sifting through years of complex financial architecture until I located the master ledger for Apex Primrose Holdings, the Delaware LLC. The routing numbers matched the fraudulent wedding invoice perfectly. But as I scrolled down the internal corporate ledger detailing every single unauthorized transfer Eleanor had made from the family trust over the last 7 years, my breath caught. The total amount stolen from Caleb's inheritance wasn't just a few $1,000s. It was exactly $850,000. I leaned back in my chair, a profound sense of professional validation washing over me. I had the smoking gun. I had the hard, irrefutable evidence required to expose Eleanor to the entire family and hand her over to the federal authorities. Then my eyes drifted to the bottom of the scanned PDF containing the foundational corporate articles of organization for the Delaware Shell Company. I needed to see whose signature was listed as the sole managing proprietor. I expected to see Eleanor's elegant cursive. I scrolled to the signature line. The air completely left my lungs. The small room suddenly felt terrifyingly cold. It wasn't Eleanor's name written in ink, the name signed on the fraudulent offshore documents. The person listed as legally and financially responsible for embezzling nearly $1 million from the family trust was Caleb. Eleanor hadn't just stolen the money, she had meticulously forged her own son's signature to do it. The trap was set. But as I stared at the screen, I realized I was the one standing directly inside it. I stared at the signature on the screen, my vision blurring for a fraction of a second before my brain forced itself back into focus. Caleb's name sat at the bottom of the Articles of Organization for Apex Primrose Holdings, rendered in sweeping fluid digital ink. It was a flawless forgery. Every precise loop of the C, the distinct sharp slant of the B, the exact spacing between his first and last name, it mimicked his handwriting with chilling, terrifying precision. My lungs felt tight, the air in our small North End apartment suddenly tasting stale and thin. The cold blue glow of the laptop monitor cast long skeletal shadows against the bedroom door. In my profession, locating the missing money is usually the finish line. You find the anomalous routing numbers, you identify the shell entity, you map the flow of capital, and you hand the file over to the legal department. The auditors go home, and the corporate lawyers take over. But the logical, sterile rules of financial auditing do not apply when the embezzler is your future mother-in-law, and the victim is the man you are going to marry. Eleanor hadn't merely skimmed cash from her late husband's estate to fund her lavish Beacon Hill lifestyle. She had constructed a financial guillotine, sharpened the blade, and placed her own son's neck directly beneath it. I needed to understand the exact internal mechanics of the trap she had built. I opened another document from the cloned master folder, my fingers flying across the trackpad. It was the operating agreement for the Offshore Limited Liability Company. Eleanor had purposefully registered the entity in Delaware. Delaware is a notorious global haven for corporate anonymity. State laws require minimal public disclosure regarding beneficial ownership. You don't need to list the names of the actual humans who own the company on public registries. You only need a faceless registered agent. Eleanor had hired a boutique, nondescript corporate services firm in Wilmington to act as the registered agent, completely shielding her identity from public records. But the internal operating agreement, the highly confidential document kept strictly for banking purposes, to open corporate credit lines and authorize wire transfers, listed Caleb as the sole managing member. I cross-referenced the dates on the formation papers with Caleb's medical background, and everything aligned with a terrifying, devastating logic. Caleb's father had passed away 7 years ago. He was a formidable, legendary chief of surgery who had built a massive, lucrative commercial YK real estate and medical portfolio across New England. Caleb had loved his father deeply, but he wanted absolutely no part in managing the massive family empire. Caleb wanted to heal people, to draft surgical plans, to reattach bones, and to build his own independent orthopedic practice from the ground up. He craved the clean satisfaction of earned success, completely untainted by generational privilege. During the chaotic, grief-stricken months following his father's sudden death, Caleb had been entirely overwhelmed. He was working 80-hour weeks as a surgical resident, drowning in sleep deprivation and mourning a massive loss. Eleanor had stepped into that window of vulnerability, flawlessly playing the role of the capable, grieving widow. She offered to shoulder the entire administrative and financial burden of the estate, claiming it would allow Caleb to focus entirely on his residency. She handed him a thick stack of legal documents to sign at her kitchen table, claiming they were routine estate management forms, probate waivers, and standard tax authorizations. He trusted his mother completely. He signed them without a second thought. Eleanor used that exact window of opportunity to secure broad power of attorney and absolute administrative control over the main estate trust. But Eleanor was highly intelligent. She knew that a power of attorney had strict legal limits. Eventually, Caleb would turn 35, and according to his father's will, the trust would fully vest into his direct exclusive control. Her unrestricted access to the fountain of cash would expire, so she set up Apex Primrose Holdings. She forged his digital signature on the internal banking documents. Then, using her power of attorney, she began authorizing regular massive wire transfers from the main estate trust into the Delaware Shell Company. The paper trail was pristine, deceptive, and entirely lethal. If a forensic accountant or an IRS agent reviewed the main trust ledger, it wouldn't look like Eleanor was stealing. It would simply look like Caleb, a wealthy heir, was actively moving his own inheritance into a private domestic investment vehicle for tax shelter purposes. No one questions a wealthy doctor transferring funds to a Delaware LLC. I closed the operating agreement and rubbed my throbbing temples. The legal reality settled over me like a suffocating blanket. If I took this cloned drive to the district attorney or the FBI tomorrow morning, what would happen? The authorities wouldn't see a tragic story of a narcissistic mother manipulating her son. They would see a shell company draining an estate. They would see Caleb's name on the registration. The objective cold paper trail suggested that Dr. Caleb was robbing his own family trust to hide assets from federal taxes, or perhaps to conceal his true net worth before entering a marriage with a middle-class woman. Wire fraud, bank fraud, and federal tax evasion carry severe federal prison sentences. The FBI does not care about toxic family dynamics or narcissistic mothers. They care about signatures, documented authorization, and bank routing numbers. Eleanor had insulated herself completely. She was legally invisible. If an investigation launched, Caleb would be the primary suspect. He would be indicted. His private orthopedic practice would instantly collapse under the weight of the federal scandal. His professional medical license would be permanently revoked, and his life would be completely ruined. We were legally checkmated. We couldn't call the police. We couldn't hire a standard defense lawyer yet. We couldn't even cancel the wedding. If we called off the ceremony, Eleanor would realize her massive scheme had been compromised. Cornered manipulators do not surrender quietly. They retaliate with nuclear force. If she sensed we were pulling away, she could instantly liquidate the remaining funds in the Delaware account, move the cash into an untraceable offshore cryptocurrency wallet, and anonymously tip off the IRS about Caleb's supposed tax evasion. She would sit back in her Beacon Hill brownstone and watch her own son take the fall while playing the role of the devastated, unsuspecting mother. Suddenly, the sharp sound of a key turning in the front door lock broke the silence of the apartment. Caleb walked into the apartment, dropping his keys into the ceramic bowl on the counter with a heavy metallic clatter. He didn't ask what we were doing for dinner. He stood in the narrow entryway, the invisible weight of a brutal 12-hour surgical shift clinging to his broad shoulders, looking at me with a fractured, deeply conflicted expression. He rubbed the back of his neck, his shirt smelling faintly of hospital antiseptic and stale coffee. "Audrey," he said, his voice flat and exhausted. "We need to talk. Do we need to postpone the wedding?" I didn't react with anger. I didn't get defensive. I kept my breathing even and asked him calmly, "Why would you suggest delaying our marriage, Caleb?" He sighed. walking into the kitchen and leaning against the quartz island. He explained that Eleanor had made a highly theatrical, unexpected appearance at his private practice earlier that afternoon. She had never once visited his office, preferring the polished marble of her country club to the practical reality of his medical clinic. But she had made a grand exception today. Caleb told me she had walked into his private office, closed the glass door, and immediately began weeping into a monogrammed silk handkerchief. She told him that I was completely unraveling under the pressure of entering high society. She claimed I had been harassing her with paranoid, aggressive delusions about the wedding budget, demanding unrestricted access to the family trust accounts, and acting suspiciously around her personal belongings in the Beacon Hill estate. Eleanor went even further. She fabricated a sudden, terrifying financial crisis. She told Caleb that the family estate was experiencing severe liquidity issues because of my supposedly reckless, extravagant spending demands for the reception. She begged her son to delay the ceremony, insisting that I needed immediate professional psychiatric help before he signed a legally binding marriage license. Julianne and Aunt Patricia's text messages had been the artillery strike. Eleanor's performance today was the ground invasion. It was a flawless psychological ambush designed to exploit Caleb's deep sense of family loyalty and his innate desire to protect people. He had come home caught entirely between the woman he planned to spend his life with and the grieving mother who had raised him. This was the exact pivot point Eleanor had engineered. It is the critical moment where a relationship either shatters under the crushing weight of external pressure or hardens into indestructible steel. I didn't defend myself. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't accuse his mother of being a pathological liar. Arguing with a master's manipulator only validates their narrative and gives them the emotional leverage they crave. Instead, I stood up from my desk, grabbed his hand, and guided him into our small home office. I sat him down in my chair and turned the laptop screen toward his face. "I'm not going to argue with your mother, Caleb," I said softly, my voice completely steady. "I'm just going to show you the data. Look at the screen." I opened the secure, encrypted cloud server where I had stored the cloned files from Eleanor's hard drive. First, I displayed the public rate sheet for the Grand Plaza, directly next to the inflated invoice his mother had forced upon us. I watched his brow furrow in deep confusion as his brain processed the blatant $35,000 discrepancy. But I didn't stop there. I opened the master ledger of Apex Primrose Holdings. I tracked the systematic flow of wire transfers from his father's trust directly into the Delaware Holding Bank. I explained the precise mechanics of offshore shell entities, detailing how registered agents shield true beneficial owners from public records. Finally, I brought up the foundational articles of organization for the shell company. I zoomed in on the very bottom of the scanned PDF document, maximizing the signature line until it filled the entire monitor. "Caleb," I whispered, "did you sign this?" The remaining color completely drained from Caleb's face. He leaned in so close to the screen that the blue light illuminated the stark, rigid lines of his jaw. He recognized the exact shape of his own name, replicated with chilling, robotic accuracy. He understood the legal implications in an instant. As an orthopedic surgeon, he signed legal medical charts every single day. He knew the weight of an authorized signature. If the IRS or the federal authorities investigated the missing $850,000, the paper trail pointed a loaded lethal weapon directly at his chest. His own mother had framed him for federal grand larceny, wire fraud, and tax evasion. Caleb sat back heavily in the chair, his hands dropping to his lap. The silence in the small room stretched out thick, heavy, and suffocating. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. A deep, profound, arctic coldness settled over his features, his eyes turning to absolute ice. The mother he knew, the woman who had raised him, had built a prison for him, just to maintain her grip on a fortune that didn't belong to her. "What do we do?" Caleb asked, his voice cracking slightly, looking up at me, not just as his fiancée, but as an analyst who specialized in surviving financial warfare. I placed my hands firmly on his shoulders, leaning down. "We don't run, and we don't confront her yet. We play her game. We let her think she's winning right up until the final second." The Arctic coldness in Caleb's eyes didn't waver as the clock on the wall ticked past midnight. He sat perfectly still, staring at the digital forgery of his life's ruin. An ordinary man would have shattered, but Caleb was trained to operate under life-or-death pressure. In the operating room, when an unexpected hemorrhage occurs, you don't panic, you isolate the bleeder. Apply pressure, and systematically repair the damage. "She didn't just steal the money, Audrey," Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave, sounding dangerously calm. "She built an insurance policy against me. If I ever tried to cut her off from the estate, or if I married someone she couldn't control, she could pull this trigger and destroy my entire existence." "Exactly," I replied, pulling up a secondary analysis on the screen. "And that is why we cannot take this cloned drive to a defense attorney or a federal prosecutor yet. In a court of law, high-priced white-collar defense attorneys can hire handwriting experts to argue over the slant of a digital pen or the metadata of a PDF file. They can claim your computer was hacked, or worse. They can argue that you authorized these transfers during the chaotic aftermath of your father's death and are now suffering from selective amnesia. Eleanor has the financial resources to drag an embezzlement case through probate and criminal courts for a decade, utterly destroying your professional reputation long before a verdict is ever reached." Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his mind racing. "So we can't use the digital paper trail to attack her directly. We need something that cuts through legal ambiguity. We need a physical, undeniable crime," I stated, my voice sharp and clinical. "We need Eleanor to commit a frantic, desperate act, captured in high-definition video. An act so legally damning, so visibly unhinged, that no defense attorney in the state of Massachusetts can spin it. In corporate fraud investigations, when a corrupt executive realizes their pristine paper trail is being monitored, they don't surrender, they panic. And when a narcissist panics, they try to physically destroy the evidence. To achieve this, we had to play the most hazardous game of chicken imaginable. We had to let Eleanor believe her psychological smear campaign was working flawlessly. We had to feed her ego, making her think she was the smartest person in the room, right up until the final second. We needed to construct a fake vulnerability, something tangible, something Eleanor could not resist destroying, because she believed it held the key to her total ruin. "The wedding cannot be postponed, Caleb," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "The wedding is no longer just a ceremony, it is the stage. And we are going to use it to hand your mother the exact tools she needs to dig her own legal grave." The next morning, we launched our counteroffensive. It began with Caleb executing his part of the script, with perfect theatrical precision. He called his mother from his office at the clinic, ensuring his voice sounded broken, strained, and thoroughly exhausted. He told her that her tears from the previous day had shaken him to his core. He admitted that he was starting to see concerning signs in my behavior, claiming that I was obsessing over the family trust ledgers and acting increasingly erratic. I could practically hear Eleanor's purr of satisfaction through the digital logs. She believed her manipulation had successfully fractured our foundation. Meanwhile, I initiated the second phase of the trap, creating the moingon, the irresistible bait. I reached out to Aunt Patricia under the guise of an emotional breakdown. I sent her a lengthy, frantic text message, intentionally riddled with spelling errors and desperate pleas. I claimed that I knew Eleanor was trying to ruin me and that I had spent the last week downloading highly confidential offshore bank ledgers from Apex Primrose Holdings onto a high-capacity military-grade encrypted flash drive. I told Patricia that I had sewn this encrypted USB drive deep into the inner satin lining of my custom bridal gown, which was currently being stored in the master walk-in wardrobe of the family's historic Cape Cod estate, where the pre-wedding dinner was set to take place. I wrote, "If Eleanor tries to make Caleb sign a prenup or cancel the ceremony, tell her I will hand this dress over to the IRS investigators the morning after the wedding. The proof is literally inside the fabric. She can't stop me." I knew with absolute certainty that Patricia would screenshot that message and send it directly to Eleanor within 5 minutes. A woman like Eleanor, whose entire identity was built on absolute legal invisibility and social dominance, would never allow that dress to cross the threshold of a church. If she believed that an encrypted drive containing $850,000 worth of federal wire fraud evidence was physically hidden inside that white fabric, her survival instincts would override her polished New England aristocratic decorum. She wouldn't try to steal the drive. She would be too terrified of an encryption password she didn't possess. She would want the evidence entirely vaporized. 3 days before the wedding, the entire family convergence shifted to the historic estate in Cape Cod. The property was a massive, sprawling colonial compound, surrounded by manicured hydrangea gardens, towering stone walls, and a private cobblestone courtyard that overlooked the grey, churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The atmosphere inside the house was thick with tension, operating like a pressure cooker, disguised as a luxury celebration. Eleanor moved through the rooms like a triumphant general, offering me cold, victorious smiles whenever Caleb wasn't looking. She truly believed she had successfully isolated me, that my supposed meltdown text to Aunt Patricia was the final, desperate gasp of a defeated outsider. But while Eleanor was busy gloating to her social peers, Caleb and I were quietly fortifying the perimeter, under the pretense of hiring a high-end videography and security team to protect the thousands of dollars worth of wedding gifts and high-society guests expected for the weekend. Caleb brought in a specialized private digital security firm from Boston. Over the course of 12 hours, while Eleanor was attending a pre-wedding luncheon at the local yacht club, technicians discreetly installed 4 state-of-the-art military-grade night vision cameras into the ivy-covered brick walls surrounding the cobblestone courtyard. The cameras were entirely invisible to the naked eye, hidden perfectly within the thick foliage and architectural molding of the estate. They were equipped with high-definition optical zoom lenses and advanced directional microphones capable of capturing the faintest whisper against the sound of the ocean waves. The live feed didn't route to the estate's main security monitors. It bypassed the house entirely, streaming directly to an encrypted cloud server and onto my phone. On Friday afternoon, my custom bridal gown arrived at the estate via a private courier. It was a stunning, heavy piece of art, synthetic lace, and thick polyester lining, altered specifically to match the weight of a garment carrying a heavy metallic object. I carried the garment bag upstairs to the grand guest suite, overlooking the courtyard, ensuring Eleanor saw me hauling it up the stairs, with a tense, protective posture. When I hung the dress inside the mahogany wardrobe, I made sure the door was left slightly ajar. I knew Eleanor would audit the room the moment I stepped out. And she did. Through a micro camera Caleb had placed on the bookshelf, we watched Eleanor slip into the guest suite while I was downstairs at dinner. She approached the wardrobe, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she felt the heavy satin lining of the gown. When her hand brushed against a small, hard piece of plastic we had intentionally stitched into the hem to mimic the shape of a rugged USB drive, her breath hitched audibly. The data was verified. The target had confirmed the existence of the bait. That evening at the rehearsal dinner, I played my part to perfection. I sat at the long candlelit table, barely touching my food, refusing to engage in conversation, and looking visibly shattered. Eleanor watched me from the head of the table, sipping her vintage wine, with the serene, terrifying satisfaction of a dictator who had successfully crushed a rebellion. She dropped subtle, cruel remarks throughout the evening, dropping hints about how Some people simply lack the emotional constitution to survive the demands of a prominent family legacy. Caleb played his role flawlessly, keeping his jaw tight, staring down at his plate, and occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand with a well-rehearsed expression of deep anxiety. To the rest of the family, it looked like a young couple on the absolute verge of an emotional collapse. At 11 o'clock, the estate finally grew quiet. The guests retired to their respective wings, the lights throughout the massive colonial compound, flickering out one by one, until only the external landscape lights illuminated the thick ocean fog rolling into the courtyard. Caleb kissed my forehead in the hallway, his hands completely steady. "I'm heading to the car down the road," he whispered, his eyes dark with determination. "The security team is live. The cloud servers are recording. Be careful, Audrey." "I'm always careful," I replied, offering him the first genuine smile I had worn in 6 months. "Let's catch a predator." I went back to the guest suite, changed into a simple pair of dark trousers, and sat on the edge of the bed in the pitch blackness. I didn't close my eyes. I didn't sleep. My phone was resting flat in my palm. The screen dimmed to the lowest setting, displaying the live 4-quadrant night vision feed of the cobblestone courtyard below. The minutes stretched into agonizing hours. The digital clock on the nightstand ticked forward with agonizing slowness: 1 a.m., 1:15 a.m., 1:30 a.m., and then at exactly 1:40 in the morning, a shadow moved across the screen. I leaned closer to the monitor, my pulse steady as I watched the French doors of the main estate creak open. Eleanor stepped out onto the cool stone, her silhouette sharp against the moonlight. She was moving with a frantic, desperate urgency, her high society composure completely evaporated in the dark. The trap was officially live. The night vision feed on my phone screen glowed a ghostly fluorescent green. I watched Eleanor cross the threshold of the guest suite's balcony doors below. She didn't look like a Beacon Hill matriarch anymore. She looked like a thief in her own home. In her arms, she clutched the heavy white mass of my bridal gown, dragging the expensive fabric across the dusty floorboards, without a single shred of her usual aristocratic reverence. Her breathing came through my phone's speaker in short, ragged, high-pitched gasps, captured flawlessly by the directional microphone hidden in the ivy just 3 feet above her head. She made her way down the winding stone staircase into the center of the cobblestone courtyard. The Atlantic fog hung low, wrapping around her champagne-colored silk robe, like a shroud. But it couldn't obscure the raw, frantic desperation etched into the sharp lines of her face. She threw the dress onto the damp stones. It landed with a heavy, muffled thud, the artificial plastic weight we had sewn into the hem clinking sharply against the rock. Hearing that sound, Eleanor let out a low, hysterical laugh. "Got you," she whispered into the empty air, her voice trembling with a terrifying blend of malice and relief. "You arrogant little parasite. You thought you could ruin me." From my dark window on the second floor, I stood perfectly still, looking down at her through the glass. I didn't open the window. I didn't give her a warning. I simply pressed the record confirmation button on my phone, verifying that the secure Boston server was capturing every single pixel of her movement in pristine, uncompressed 4K resolution. Eleanor reached into the deep pocket of her robe and pulled out a heavy, vintage gold lighter, the family heirloom that had belonged to Caleb's father. She flipped the cap open with a sharp, metallic clack. The small yellow flame flared to life, casting an eerie, demonic orange glow across her features. She didn't hesitate. She knelt on the wet cobblestones, her silk robe dragging in the dirt, and pressed the flame directly against the delicate, intricate synthetic lace of the train. The fire caught instantly. Because the gown was constructed primarily of premium polyester and synthetic blends materials I had specifically approved because of their high flammability and toxic chemical reaction, the fabric didn't just burn, it erupted. Thick, acrid black smoke began billowing into the midnight sky, the heavy chemical stench of melting plastic and liquid silk immediately overriding the crisp, salty scent of the ocean air. Eleanor scrambled backward, her face illuminated by the rising blaze. She stood there, silhouetted against the roaring orange fire, her eyes wide and manic as she watched the $5,000 gown curl, blacken, and dissolve into a toxic sludge on the stone. "Burn," she muttered, a triumphant, psychotic smile stretching across her face as she watched the specific corner of the hem containing the fake USB drive melt into liquid ash. "Go back to the gutter where you belong, Audrey. You have nothing." She truly believed she was vaporizing the evidence of her $850,000 embezzlement scheme. She believed that by destroying this piece of fabric, she was securing her freedom, her status, and her absolute control over Caleb's life forever. I waited exactly 3 minutes, allowing the camera to record the full cycle of her actions, from the initial ignition to her standing proudly over the destructive wreckage. Once the dress was completely reduced to a pile of smouldering black chemical sludge, I turned on the flashlight on my phone, illuminating my own face from below, and pushed the French doors open. The heavy wood creaked as it swung wide. Eleanor flinched her head, snapping upward. The triumphant smile on her face froze, shattering instantly into a mask of pure horror as she saw me standing on the balcony looking down at her with a calm, clinical indifference. The cut of that dress never really suited my frame anyway. I said, my voice deadpan, cutting through the crackle of the dying embers. "But the fire is an interesting touch, Eleanor. Very theatrical." Her breath caught in her throat. Her left hand began to tremble violently, the gold lighter rattling loudly against the heavy platinum rings on her fingers. "Audrey," she stammered, trying desperately to pull her polished New England composure back over her face like a torn mask. I smelled smoke. I came out here to find the dress already on fire. Someone tried to sabotage the wedding. It was a pathetic, uninspired lie. A classic desperate defense from a white-collar criminal caught red-handed in the light. "Save it, Eleanor," I said smoothly, stepping out onto the balcony edge. "The performance is over." Right at that exact second, the heavy iron gates of the estate courtyard swung open with a loud mechanical groan. The bright, piercing halogen headlights of a black SUV cut through the thick ocean fog, blinding Eleanor and casting her long, distorted shadow against the brick walls. The vehicle tore across the gravel driveway, braking hard right at the edge of the cobblestones. The driver's side door flung open, and Caleb stepped out. But he wasn't alone. From the passenger side and the rear doors, 3 men in dark, tailored suits stepped into the firelight. One of them carried a rugged, weatherproof corporate briefcase. The other 2 stood with the rigid, unmistakable posture of federal law enforcement officials. Eleanor spun around her face, turning a ghastly, translucent white as she looked at her son. "Caleb, thank God you're here. Your fiancée. She's completely lost her mind. She set her own dress on fire to frame me." "Shut up, Mum," Caleb said. The words weren't delivered with anger or shouting. They were spoken with a terrifying absolute finality that froze the air in the courtyard. Caleb walked past her without making eye contact, his boots crunching against the wet gravel, and stood directly beside the man carrying the briefcase. I walked down the external stone staircase, my bare feet hitting the cold ground, and joined them. The man with the briefcase stepped forward, opening the latch with a crisp, professional click. He pulled out a thick-bound legal document and handed it directly to Eleanor. "Mrs. Sterling," the man said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "My name is Special Agent Miller from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. This is an emergency corporate freeze and asset seizure warrant for Apex Primrose Holdings, a Delaware limited liability company registered under your administrative control." Eleanor stumbled backward, the thick legal document heavy in her trembling hands. This is a mistake. That company belongs to Caleb. He authorized every single transfer. If there is fraud, it's his signature on the paperwork. She turned to Caleb, her eyes wide with a desperate, feral threat. Tell them, Caleb. Tell them you signed those documents. If I go down, your medical license goes down with me. You'll never practice medicine in this country again. Caleb looked at his mother, his eyes completely dead, devoid of a single ounce of filial affection. I didn't sign anything, Mum, Caleb said softly. And we aren't here about the digital paperwork anymore. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen once, casting the live video playback directly to the massive outdoor weatherproof entertainment monitor mounted on the brick wall behind her. The screen flared to life. In crystal clear, high-definition 4K night vision, Eleanor's own face filled the monitor. The audio echoed through the courtyard, loud and undeniable. Got you, Six, you arrogant little parasite. You thought you could ruin me, burn. The footage showed her clearly pulling the vintage gold lighter from her pocket, striking the flame, and intentionally burning the dress to destroy what she explicitly stated was federal evidence. That is a video of you actively destroying what you believe to be a federal encrypted drive containing evidence of a multi-thousand-dollar embezzlement scheme. I explained, stepping forward, my voice cutting through her panic like a scalpel. In the state of Massachusetts, and under federal law section 1512, that is called willful destruction of evidence and obstruction of justice. It's a non-bailable federal felony. I paused, looking at the pile of melting synthetic lace at her feet. The digital paper trail was complex, Eleanor. You forged Caleb's name perfectly. But a video of you burning a bridal gown to hide an offshore account, that's simple. That's cinematic. Even the cheapest jury in Boston can understand that. Eleanor looked from the monitor to the federal agents, then finally to her son. The realization hit her all at once. There was no USB drive in the dress. The entire sequence of events, the texts, the breakdown, the hidden gown, had been a beautifully orchestrated choreography designed to make her commit a visible, undeniable crime in front of a federal camera. The gold lighter slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the cobblestones with a dull, final thud. "You're done, Eleanor," Caleb said, turning his back on her as the federal agents stepped forward with the handcuffs. "The estate trust belongs to me now, and the wedding is still happening on Sunday. You just won't be on the guest list."